Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Figuratively Feasting. My name is James Gopp. I'm here with my sidekick, Mr. Simeon Mordecai Bittman. And today, man, I am excited. This is my favorite time of year. It's autumn. The weather's starting to get cooler. The food's starting to get a little bit more hearty. And for whatever reason, the bed is feeling real good. I love it. I really love it. So today we're going to be touching on all different kinds of things. Really, way back in the day, this time of year was insane. So much was going on. People were racing here on the East Coast to get as much food as they possibly could packed up to sustain them through the winter. So today we're going to be touching, basically, really, if I'm being honest, scratching the surface on a topic that's so deep. But we're going to be going into preservation, specifically fermentation, salting, all different kinds of things like that. Mr. Simeon.
Yes, sir.
How are you? I know last week you were riding off a high. Do you still have that high for this week?
And I'm stoked, too. I'm still all jazzed up.
It's good.
Ready to rock, still feeding off of that adrenaline. Plus, you and I got to have a nice afternoon and evening together this past Saturday, which is always recharging and exhausting at the same exact time.
Yeah, and as we talked about it maybe in the last podcast or so, when we're referencing an actual wedding, a micro wedding that we did together. This time of year, it's great to get to hang out with Simeon not only on Tuesdays, but I get to cook with him also over fire, which is so meaningful for both of us.
Yeah.
And the beautiful couple we got to cook for this week. And it was so amazing in this
They were
beautiful
cool.
location, August Moon, down in Sheffield, Massachusetts. There's so much history there for me. Maybe we'll get into that at a different point in time.
Yeah.
But it is a beautiful location. We've worked there a lot. The couple, I love them dearly.
They
The
were
location
great.
is beautiful. No, the couple that owns the property. The couple that we
right.
worked with also was absolutely lovely. And if you all remember last podcast, for Simeon's birthday, I ended up getting him this bottle of this campfire whiskey, and it became an interesting piece of our conversation with the groom. Because apparently from that same distillery, they make something called, what was it called? Yippee-ki-yay?
Yeah.
I think it was called Yippee-ki-yay.
Exactly.
It was like this limited batch of this whiskey, and it was delicious. And he shared it with us. Apparently, he went around to a lot of different places and found all of these bottles. They've been discontinued or hard to find. So,
Such a cool moment.
yeah, that was a
Back
beautiful
in the-
moment to share.
In the kitchen
Back in the kitchen.
by
yeah.
the big butcher block table.
Yes, absolutely.
Sitting there in the dark.
Yeah, man, a lot of good
Toasting.
conversations. Yeah, toasting.
Cool.
A lot of good conversations happen in that particular area. But anyhow, so let's get down to our topic here, man.
Yeah, let's do it, man. I know you're all stoked up about it. I love it.
I
love your
am.
momentum this week. Kind of carried us through.
well.
Got us prepared, ready to rip for this one.
It is a big part of what we do as a business. Preservation and as little that we can produce waste is the way to be, for sure. So a big part of that is preservation in so many different ways. So Simeon, I'm going to kick the ball to you a little bit here.
Yes, sir.
For the folks that are out there, maybe novices that are getting into preservation, what is the broad definition of preservation?
Yeah, in my eyes, preservation is extending the life of vegetable, dairy, or meat in order to preserve it, really, in order to have it around when we want it to be there.
Yep.
And also to make sure that that particular product is not wasted.
Yes.
If there is no other plan for fresh preparation, the chances are it should get put by, as they say, put up, also, as they say.
Yes.
And there are so many different ways to do this.
Yeah.
You find in the process that flavors can actually be enhanced, concentrated, and you can also find new flavors start to develop out of these particular products. And it's a really beautiful process that once had a lot to do with survival of the species.
Yeah.
It took some ingenuity to figure this out, actually.
And a lot of times, a lot
lot
of times interrupt, but a lot of times it wasn't even about necessarily flavor. It was literally about just surviving. I mean, you look at things like pemmican or smoked meat, like bison meat back when you had these, early explorers, or even venison. Venison just smoked.
Like fermented yak meat in the Himalayas.
Sure, yeah.
It's like that can't, like it doesn't sound, when I've read about it, like people eating it doesn't sound like it was good. It was like, I got to survive.
Fermented yak meat. Wow.
It's yak jerky.
Yeah, I'm a little bit I'm a little bummed. I wish we would have been able to get access to some of this weird stuff, but
We got some. We got some.
we have some. But we'll get into more stuff. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please.
Okay. What was I saying? So preservation, flavors are enhanced, textures change, and otherwise beautiful things happen with this sort of going with the flow with the bacteria and mold that starts to collect on something as it's getting older. And through time, we've been able as a species to figure out which of those bacteria and molds is actually helpful to the aging and preservation process and which are definitely not. And it's really those particular bacteria and fungi that make this preserved food so great and make it last for as long as it does. Sounds counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
Something that's like mold and bacteria should not be producing something that's like shelf stable or something that could last for a long time.
Right, but also so many things that, I mean, in addition to it being delicious and interesting and preserving it, but it's also in some cases really good for you.
Yeah, right.
And that's the
right. I
interesting
keep
thing.
forgetting to say that. It's
No,
totally
it's
right.
all right. Don't worry about it, man. It is crazy. It's totally counterintuitive because we have been trained as a society. You open up that container of milk, it smells sour, empty it down the drain.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the way to be. But you could turn that into a real quick fresh cheese. It's so simple, like a ricotta cheese, turning the cheese curds, put it into a pot, bring it up to about 180 degrees, but you don't even need to get as fussy as looking at a thermometer.
Yeah.
Just bring it up over kind of low temperature, otherwise you'll be scalding the bottom of it. Bring it up until light bubbles form around the outside till it just begins to steam. That's usually the indicator of it being around 180 degrees.
Yeah, man.
Then afterwards, pour in lemon juice, vinegar, apple cider vinegar, whatever you have, something that's acidic. Think vinegar. Pour that in there, and a good rule of thumb is almost to, kind of pour in enough till it starts to smell like vinegar. Turn off the heat, stir it, and just let it hang out. What naturally will happen is the milk solids will separate from the whey. You take those milk solids, put them into cheesecloth or a fine mesh strainer.
Yep.
There you go. Season it. There's your ricotta cheese. Your whey can be used in many different ways.
Yeah.
Soup.
Totally.
Soup is great, cooking your grains in it. You can actually put it into fruit smoothies and things like that because you think about whey protein concentrate. That's what that is, it's high in protein.
Yeah.
So, and worst comes to worst, feed it to your animals, pour it outside, whatever. Pour it into your compost, feed your plants. It's a wonderful product.
Whoa. Man, as you're speaking, that all sounds freaking delicious.
Yeah.
But a couple things. One is that particular process is utilized in different parts of the world, too. There's fresh pressed cheese that's made in India that way.
Oh, yeah. What is that?
Paneer.
Exactly. Yes. And most of you folks maybe have had palak paneer.
Yeah.
Right? With a
Spinach.
spinach. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Cubing it up.
Yeah.
It's delicious.
It's so good.
Simple.
Yep. But another thought that occurred to me, of course, is because I always get all spacey and pulled back, man, is that we totally coexist and live with bacteria and fungus and mold. It's surrounding us. It's in us. It's like, they say that there's like a million different types of bacteria that just live in your like eyebrow.
Yeah, sure. Beard.
Right.
Sure.
Right. Totally. Yeah. And we live among viruses too. I mean, that's a whole other topic to think about too, but similar. We live with these things, and over time, as we've evolved, as we've grown, as we've obviously survived and done a pretty good job surviving, we've figured out how to live in some sort of symbiosis with this bacteria and mold.
Sure. I think it is you talk about your gut flora.
Right.
So something that you might not think. Everyday items that we live with that are fermented that you may not even think about it to a degree. Yogurt. Yogurt is a really big one. That is really good for our stomach. It's probiotic. It helps us break down food in our system and gives us a healthy digestive tract. If we don't have that, there's serious problems can occur. That's a great example of a bacteria that's hugely beneficial to us. Hot sauces. Obviously salamis, cheeses, hard cheeses like your cheddars or bries or things like that.
Dude, chocolate
Chocolate,
goes through
that's
a
right.
fermentation process. Coffee goes through a fermentation process.
So much. Every day it surrounds us. And these are particular things. We're talking about fermentation when you are looking at something that's fizzing or bubbling. Wine, beer. One of the oldest, arguably most popular items that the world consumes is alcohol and beer. I mean, we were talking about this at this event on Saturday. I watched this documentary. I think it's called How Beer Saved the World or something like that, where basically the creation of beer, fermentation, how we learned as a species. Of course, none of us were there. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. But the prevailing theory is that hunter-gatherers, as we were back then, Homo erectus, like we talked about way back here. Well, this is episode number 7.
Yeah.
So, but it feels like a long
1.4
time
million
ago.
years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, and that does feel like 1.4 million years ago.
In
that
a
we
lot of
talked
ways.
about that.
In a lot of ways, yeah. So going out, collecting wheat berries, barley, whatever was growing out there wild in these plains, collect them in some sort of basket or whatever. It rains, maybe the person was a little bit careless. It collects rainwater. Between water, the yeast, the wild yeast that's in the air, the sugar that's already in the grains, the starch, fermentation starts to happen. Maybe that bucket whole thing fills up, they forget about it or whatever, it starts to ferment. All of a sudden they go to eat it and they're like, ooh. I mean, I don't know, like, really at that point. I mean, obviously it must have felt good, but...
Yeah, and I would argue, not argue because it's not an argument, but I would think also that it eventually sort of happened. There was all kinds of stuff rotting and going wrong. There were grains that were rotting in weird ways, and it was just becoming totally undesirable. Or sometimes people were like, I know that this grain is freaking rotten and it's sitting in this liquid, but like, yo, I need to eat. And like, so does my family. Otherwise, we're going to die.
Oh,
like,
of course.
We need some food.
Of course.
And so they put it down, and they were like, all right, this batch is pretty gross, but at least we're going to live. Or, oh, no, this batch made us all puke all night long. And then finally, maybe, or like one time, they were like, oh, this is good when this happens, but I don't understand why or how.
Right. So then what was that like? Was that then like, let's figure out, okay, with that sort of primitive brain that they had, how did they then decide to say, oh, how can I recreate these conditions?
Right. Was it like one person, like in the community that just thought about it, because not everybody thinks that way. Some people are just like, oh, just stumbling along, especially in survival mode. It's like you're just eating stuff. You're not thinking about how to make it good or how to manipulate it or whatever.
No, but it's interesting to think about those types of things because sake, I mean, there's so many instances of preservation, fermentation, many, many food dishes that are across the world that are influenced by certain things.
Yeah.
And how... Was it one person or was it just somehow in us? That's a fascinating thing about humans.
Yeah.
How did they all come to a certain type of idea?
Yeah.
When it comes to so many dishes, it's crazy. I think alcohol was noticed something about somewhere around 100,000 BC.
It's wild.
That's insane that all these different things were happening all at once. So, then you get into, when you're talking about fermentation, liquid, alcohol, then vinegars. That's another interesting thing is like when you let alcohol oxidize or continued exposure to different wild yeasts.
Agar, by the way. Sour wine. Vin is wine.
Sure.
Agar means sour.
From where? Which language?
That's Latin.
Oh, interesting. Huh. Well, makes sense. So there you go. And then that whole process and who was tasting that and actually understanding to cook with it, to drink it. I mean, maybe it was thought about at that point in time. I have no idea what I'm talking about here, but maybe it was thought about as some sort of medicinal kind of tincture or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I remember reading about it at some point. The Greeks stumbled upon it because in trying to make wine.
Yeah.
And it went sour,
Yeah, sure.
And they realized how they could manipulate it. They actually figured out that it was surface area. If there was a large enough surface area of the fermenting wine, enough oxygen hitting it, it would turn to vinegar. And they realized, like, oh, this is actually kind of good to season with and stuff. So it's not all for waste.
Yeah, vinegars, we make a ton of that stuff here going on, and we can get into that a little bit later. But, I mean, there's just so many different other ways, too, of preserving, freezing, canning, dehydrating, smoking, all those types of things.
Lacto-fermenting.
Yeah, lacto-fermenting. Yeah.
Using particular types of bacteria, calling them from the air, calling them forth.
Yeah, that's right. That's fantastic. And then even like sourdough bread that you guys maybe have tapped into during the COVID era here, that is literally just collecting wild yeast that is floating around. I mean, right now, both of us, whether you can see it or not, are covered in wild yeast.
Isn't
There's
that
yeast
attractive?
everywhere. Yeah. So really, I mean, for those of you who have not tried to capture their own wild yeast starter, really what you do is just get a container, add enough water. It's basically probably equal parts water and flour. Cover it with cheesecloth. Let it go outside. Let it do its thing for a while. Now, as the East Coast, we're getting into a sort of a chilly time.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
Optimum temperatures are going to be in the 70s and 80s to capture it. But you want to just make sure that it starts to collect. Stir it up once a day, and it'll naturally collect the wild yeast, and it'll start feeding off all the starch in there. And there's your sourdough starter.
Yeah.
So it's pretty fascinating stuff. I mean, so many beautiful foods are from fermentation, pickling, preservation.
Yeah.
Other things now at this point in time. I mean, for me, I'm like stacking up my my root cellar with potatoes, carrots. It's cold enough now, so we can start growing radishes, which then will probably go into maybe probably like a quick pickle, a vinegar-based pickle,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
There are other crazy things too. People preserving eggs, not the 100-year eggs, but regular eggs in a lye solution or water glass, which is something called sodium silicate, which helps. Because in the wintertime, for those of you who don't know, who don't own chickens, basically when the lack of sunlight somehow tricks them into their brains as how long the days are, and they stop laying as many eggs. So during that summertime, chickens are laying eggs once a day. You want to collect them, put them up, save them somehow. I mean, right now I probably have close to 3 dozen eggs just because I haven't been eating them a lot. I've been busy. I'm contemplating messing around with that this year. It's pretty wild, though.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
That sounds like a really cool idea. Yeah, I think I've read barbaric. I never tried it, so I don't know if it really works, but I've read barbaric enough recipes where you basically just take an egg and like shell and all and just bury it in salt and just let it do its thing.
Sure.
Like it's fine in there, and it slowly will suck out enough moisture that any bacteria that could be harmful was just gone. It won't be able to survive in there anymore. And that the shell is like a permeable.
It is. It's very
surface.
porous. Yeah,
Porous.
exactly. And that kind of goes into a lot of charcuterie, too, as well, sort of like this osmosis reaction. So, I mean, there's so many great things, but there's also some weird stuff.
Oh, my God. I was checking out something real cool that I always was interested in.
Yeah, so there's things like the 100-year egg, we just mentioned a couple minutes ago, this fermented shark, which is really big in Scandinavia.
Yeah, in Iceland.
In Iceland, specifically. And also, like a cheese that's been aged and to the point where maggots grow in it. It's considered to be a delicacy. So, what do you know? I know we've been talking a little bit about the shark, so talk about that. I mean, and I'm sure some of the folks out there that are into food, they know. They've heard of this, like, fermented shark. Anthony Bourdain, I think, has eaten it. Andrew Zimmern. Zimmern. It's crazy. So, I mean, truth be told, I've watched a few different things, but I've really held off any research because I wanted to hear about it. I want to learn about it from you.
Yeah, nice, man. Thanks. Yeah, and also, there's probably people who would listen to this and be like, yeah, that's like part of our life.
Yeah, exactly.
Like fermented shark and maggot cheese is like a thing.
Yeah.
And, we Americans are like shocked about this stuff.
And can you imagine, though, like how shocked they are about our fast food, junk food type of behavior. So it's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
Certainly.
So fermented shark, it's pretty simple. There's a particular type of shark. I think it's called yellow shark sometimes. It has some other names too. But it is really poisonous to humans because it's covered in urea, which is basically pee, but like super duper concentrated pee, and that's what's on its skin.
Interesting.
So that's its defense mechanism
against other predators outside of humans.
Yeah, right. It's just like, I'm not sure why it repels. Maybe because it stinks and it's like sort of a mucus kind of layer that surrounds fish. There are other fish that have it too, that have this similar thing. The urea needs to be ameliorated, otherwise it's really harmful. You have a little bit, you might get really, 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 really sick. I was watching this video, the guy was like, a little bit, you get very, very sick. A little more, you go blind. A little more, you die. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
So they actually take this fish that will kill you in 3 bites and chop it up. And there are various different approaches, obviously, but basically put it in a pit that has semi-decent circulation. So imagine like pallets shaped, stood up into a box.
Yeah, right.
And then you just chuck in a bunch of chunks of fish. Separate them a little bit from basically like dark meat and white meat. Belly meat is a particular type of fermented shark meat. And
Desirable or not desirable?
yeah, desirable. Just like a totally different texture.
Sure.
Like it's more like a soft brie cheese when you slice into it eventually.
All right, so you throw it into the
anyway,
box.
You throw it in the box.
Yep.
And the urea slowly either transforms or ammonia comes in.
Well, do we salt it, or is it just straight up raw?
Yeah, it never
dog?
gets anything. It never gets salted. It
What?
never gets anything. It just sits there in its own juices
God,
and
that must
develops
reek.
ammonia. Like imagine the smell of ammonia.
Yeah, right. Yeah, when I was younger, I went and played a game of miniature golf. I think it was up in Rhode Island or something. And there was a fish processing plant,
Funny story.
and all you could smell was ammonia. It was so foul, like it was so hard to breathe around there because all you could smell was ammonia.
That's so interesting. I never realized that it was the prevailing smell. Like I imagine fish sauce.
Yeah.
And I saw it, like it's been, it's being used. Garum, fish garum was
sure.
like something that the Greeks figured out.
Right.
And they have these like old vats. It's like these old, almost cement-looking tanks.
Yeah.
That the garum used to be in.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It was like fish organs, and then just fish carcasses and bones just left to like rot with a lot of salt. Imagine like that. I guess it smelled like ammonia. I don't know. It didn't smell a lot like the final fish sauce that I smell now.
Yeah, to go down that road, to think about just winging it, because who would ever thought to put fish carcasses and guts into a big vat, a concrete vat, and salt it, and then come up with something really interesting?
Right.
I know there's also like a quick garum that's like cooked, which doesn't have that like jet black sort of property to it, and it's kind of like a grayish, murky water, which
Whoa.
not interested in that. But it's interesting that's you know what I mean? It's kind of inspiring in a way. Like, can you do it with beets? Can you do it with carrots? What is it like if you just take a bunch of onions, slice them, sprinkle them with salt, and let that liquid leak out? Take that liquid and then age it. Like, what is that like? Does sulfur die off? Do you age it in something specific? Yeah. So it's a great way to look at old recipes, then get inspired by them and say, why not? Why don't I try doing this?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, discretion advised. I'm going to go ahead and say with all the recipes we're talking about today and all the things, do not kind of create any product to sell to anyone else. If you're going to do it yourself. Try it on yourself, but be very careful. Do research, because some of this stuff with preservation, molds, not all mold is created equal.
Yeah.
You may get very sick.
Yeah.
So you have to understand the different molds, and I encourage you to get as much literature as you possibly can.
Yeah.
Study, talk about, learn about pHs, learn about different bacteria. A lot of us that are cooks so far probably take something like a Surf Safe course or some sort of safe food handling course. Observe all of those things you learned, because it's not to be messed with. You can get sick.
Yeah, totally. And then ultimately just experience this stuff, like try things and watch what happens and know how to figure out when things are going south.
Yeah.
Know how to tell when things are going south. And don't get scared if you start smelling stuff that smells weird. It doesn't necessarily mean anything bad is happening. It could be exactly what you want to happen, like stinky cheeses. So stinky, right?
So stinky. And even fermented liquid, something growing on top. Scrape it off.
Yeah, it can easily
Different
be
things.
scraped. Gently scraped.
If you fail, because there's a lot of weird stuff that happens, in life, I think the biggest teacher is failure. And you don't look at it as failure. You look at it as an opportunity to learn. So don't get too discouraged by that, because you mess something up, record, and then try to understand why that happened, and don't repeat the same mistake. You may repeat the same mistake, but you got to get to the bottom as to why it happened, and then move forward, and then grow.
Which is cool. Can I ask you actually a question about something?
Yeah, sure.
Vinegar.
Yep.
Particular vinegars. I'm just a little shaken because the last 2 batches, which were the first 2 batches of apple cider vinegar that I ever made, just totally haven't worked out.
So it was just like dead tasting. So what was it
Yeah,
like?
you're exactly right.
So it was just like limp water or something?
It was like moldy, mildewy, sort of sour, bitter water.
Okay, so I mean, I'm going to preface this with saying that I'm not by any means a vinegar expert.
Yeah.
But in order to create vinegar, you need to first create alcohol.
Yeah.
Now, and a lot of that depends on what type of apple you're using. What is the ratio? And there's a lot of people that will create apple cider vinegar by not adding any sugar, additional sugar. I would encourage you to taste the liquid when you're done. Does it taste actually sweet? If it doesn't taste sweet, add a little bit of sugar to it. Mix it in. And then
just to really make sure that alcohol starts happening.
Exactly, because you're going to need. And then do you put yeast in there? Or are you just going to let it go straight up wild?
I let it go straight up wild both times.
So, and that's kind of challenging too. Now, speaking about different fermentation stuff, when you're adding a specific yeast, and there are various types of yeasts that will yield you different results.
Right.
There's like white wine yeast.
Yeah.
There's like
Saison.
Sure. Yeah. There's all different kinds. There's red wine yeast, all different kinds of stuff. But you can also just use regular bread yeast that might be in your cabinet as well. I mean, that will help. That will do the job. You're not going to get the complexities and certain notes.
Yeah.
But
Like
still
I was
works.
relying on just what was in the air, really.
Yeah, so and the only problem with that, it's like natural fermenting. A lot of natural fermenting can be dangerous simply because when you already add a specific kind of yeast in a certain dose, you're going to give that particular yeast a leg up. It's not going to have to compete with other yeasts.
Right.
If you let go wild, you're going to have various types of yeasts that are going to go in there and they're going to be competing, and ultimately they might just cancel everything out like you're talking about. Or you said there was some mold, so maybe one yeast sort of prevailed over another yeast.
Yeah, it was like the right yeast did their job by and by because it got sour, and it was very alcoholic at the beginning, and I boiled that off, and then I let it.
Oh.
I quickly brought it to a boil. I read that as a step in the process.
No, I've never done that.
Huh.
No, I mean, so that's the difference between pasteurized and raw. So you pasteurized it, you brought to a quick, boil, like the old Louis Pasteur method there to kill any sort of residual bacteria. We only ever use raw apple cider vinegar here. The difference, well, there's another thing too, which you have to be careful with, because when you're aging vinegars, you can basically let it sit out. What will start to happen is you have a vinegar mother that develops on top of your vinegar, which is basically a float. And there's all these microbes. That's their home. It's their apartment. It's their house. And what they're doing is they're eating all the alcohol and converting it into acetic acid. Which basically, because the pH drops so low, it makes it inhabitable for any other bacteria to grow. And that's the way it preserves itself. Because, I mean, it just basically makes it inhabitable for itself and keeps reproducing. But the problem is, over a period of time, once all of the alcohol is consumed, now, the longer you let vinegar age, it will begin to become more and more funky, more and more sour. There is a stage when it becomes to a point where there's no more alcohol left, and it'll start actually consuming the vinegar and raising the pH. And then what happens at that point is then all kinds of other bacteria. It's like a block party. They're like, oh, all right, little party over here. Let me get in on that. And then that might have what happened, because you said it tasted sour.
That's when I boiled it. Yeah, right. That's when I boiled it. I waited until most of the alcoholic activity was like gone.
Did you put a bubbler on top of it?
Yeah, and just to ensure that the alcohol would stop and that it would start producing acetic acid like crazy, I guess is what I read. You just quickly bring it up to heat at that point.
So, I mean, again, I'm not an expert, but if you're saying that you had a bubbler,
maybe I read it wrong. Maybe I interpreted it wrong.
Well, you had a bubbler on it and it stopped bubbling, and then you immediately brought it to a boil afterwards, and you cooked off the alcohol.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so then therefore there was nothing for the microbes to eat. They consume alcohol. So if you cooked off all of the alcohol, there was nothing for them. And not to mention, you cook off the alcohol, but you also cooked off the bacteria. If you brought it to a boil, you killed all the bacteria. So therefore, there was just no activity whatsoever, and you had sterile water sitting and aging.
Yeah.
So
That makes sense.
yeah, so what I would say is if you wanted to go the route of pasteurizing, I would do the same process, let it be done bubbling.
No, I don't. I just wanted to.
No, well, do it.
I don't give a shit about pasteurizing.
No, well, don't worry about pasteurizing. But I would bring it up to the point of, have your bubbler. That's the idea. You want that to go. And honestly, you don't even need to do that. If you're going to make vinegar and you're okay with it going to vinegar, just let it sit in a how we do it is like, these big sort of big buckets with a lid on top with holes cut in and cheesecloth sealed in so that nothing can into it. So it breathes. That's what activates the mother. At that point, you're tasting it, you're checking it.
Yeah.
You want it to turn to alcohol. You'll know when it does. But that's the reason why the bubbler is good, because you'll know, and then once it's done bubbling, then you can put it into a different vessel and let it oxidize and get to be vinegar and taste it. Taste it after a month. Based off of my experience, you can let it ride for about 6 months. Now, a couple things will happen. Different mothers will happen. They'll fall to the bottom, fall to the bottom, fall to the bottom. When you're done with your mother, when you're happy with that, you need to store it in some level of vinegar.
Yeah.
So you pour some of that vinegar you made into a vac pack bag or some airtight container and put it into the refrigerator, and it will lay dormant. It will last for a very, very long time. And when you're making vinegar, you don't need to put that whole big whatever size vessel, because it will cover as much as you want it to. You only really need to tear off a small piece, maybe like a $50 size, and throw it in there, and it will propagate. And people have had handed down vinegar mothers for generations, man.
Yeah.
It's like it's a fun thing.
Yeah. Similar, it makes me think about kombucha.
No?
Kombucha is fermented or produced by the use of a mother. And
What do they call it? What do they call that?
a SCOBY.
SCOBY.
Yeah.
Where does that? Do you know where that comes from?
It's an acronym. An acronym? It's an acronym. Symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. So it's just like this supercharged, ready to rock fermenter.
It's like weird looking. It looks like a little piece of like cauliflower or something, right?
Cauliflower?
Yeah, it kind of looks bumpy and stuff. Or what is it?
It's like jelly. It's like it looks like a thick jellyfish.
So then, maybe, because I've seen people get like freeze-dried SCOBYs.
Oh,
and
yeah.
And I think that's what it kind of looks like, a little piece of popcorn.
Oh,
or
that's
something
interesting.
Like that.
I've never seen that.
Yeah, well, right.
But yeah, it's cool. It's like jelly gooey. You can actually candy it. I've candied it before and made like SCOBY gummies.
Really? What is that like?
It's freaking weird.
And
dude.
why did you do that? Did you see a recipe, or what
Because
provoked
once you get into producing kombucha, like mothers or SCOBYs just start producing, and they'll get like real big, and you can have once you start, like if you really start getting into it, like I did at one point, you've got all these different SCOBYs from different batches with different flavors, and they're just all over the place. And you're like, dude, what am I going to do with all these SCOBYs? They're freaking everywhere. And this one just tastes like cherries. And I don't really want to make cherry kombucha anymore.
Sure.
So you like...
Right. It's the same thing with the vinegar mothers, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting how that works.
What?
That's just interesting how that, like, you have different ones, and you could incorporate maybe a batch of a cherry and something else.
Yeah, and, you don't have to... There's ways around that, too. Like, you can ferment using only one SCOBY, and then when you've reached the flavor and level of the kombucha that you want, like when it tastes how you like it, you can pull the SCOBY off, infuse it with your cherry juice or whatever, and let it finish without the SCOBY.
So what's the story with that, with kombucha? Like, what is it? So it's there's a varying degree, a mild degree of alcohol in there. Is that correct?
Yeah, right? Obviously.
So walk us through for the folks that haven't been a part of this.
Yeah.
Well, hang on. Before we do that, one other thing I wanted to add, because it reminded me of making gummies and sourdough bread. So you guys that have been making that, you have an excess amount of starter. You got to scrape it off.
Oh my God, so much starter.
Yeah, right. So there's this common idea of just throwing it out, throwing in compost. You know what's the best use for it? It's like one of the most delightful breakfast treats.
Oh, tell me.
Get a good pan going, hot.
Yeah.
Right. You take your starter off.
Yeah.
You put it into a bowl. You get a hot pan going with a good amount of oil in there. We're talking about shallow frying here.
Okay.
So probably 3 tablespoons. If you're pushing it 4 tablespoons, if you just don't care and you're living reckless, right?
Like latkes.
Yeah, exactly right. That's exactly right. So you add maybe like for me, what I really like is like maybe like za'atar or those types of seasonings, like really like sumac forward, maybe thyme, whatever you have really. It could be garlic, a little bit of salt. Basically, what you're making is like this really savory, delicious pancake flatbread.
Oh my God!
Get it going to the point where it's smoking. Pour your starter in there, straight up, right? Let it get really crispy, and it's sour. It's sour on its own because of that beautiful bacteria.
Oh.
Right? And then you can add a little bit of maybe maple syrup on top. You get that funky sour. You got good salts. You got good sweetness on there.
Yeah.
So it's a really fantastic thing.
Man, that
I just want to throw that tip
awesome.
over there because so many people throw it out and they don't know what to do with it. But that is a really terrific way to enjoy it.
That's awesome, man.
All right, so walk us through kombucha.
Kombucha. So you brew some tea, and you add some sugar to it.
You say tea. What kind?
Black tea, green tea. Those are preferable.
What about if I want to do
You're
Earl
looking-
Grey tea or something? Could it be like a dealer's choice kind of situation? Or what?
I think so. Yeah, it could be Earl Grey. Black tea and green tea, really. You're looking to feed your SCOBY. And there are compounds in black tea and green tea, but I think more so black tea from what I've come to understand, that your SCOBY likes, and it keeps your SCOBY strong and robust. So you're like maintaining SCOBY health from the type of tea that you use, which should be black. And although some people have perfected this balance of black tea and green tea, there's some that use all green tea, but it's said from what I've checked out that you don't end up with the healthiest SCOBY that way. Eventually, your
By doing the
SCOBY
blend?
will die. Just doing straight up green tea. But a blend can work. So you end up with the strength of a black tea, but also sort of like the smooth, mild, almost citrusy quality of a green tea.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you make your tea for whatever it is. And now quickly, it's also interesting too, like going back to sourdough. Sourdough loves starch. It loves the carbs, the grains, or whatever. That's its fuel.
Your SCOBY loves that sugar.
Yeah.
So you're brewing tea and you're adding a bunch of sugar to it.
But also there's some compounds in the tea that is also beneficial for it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Okay. So
Yeah.
continue.
Then once the tea has come down in temperature and it's like close to body temperature, but it could still be in the low 100s, you add your mother in and forget about it depends on the season, but forget about it usually for at least 5 days.
How do you hold the mother?
Same as a vinegar mother.
In a little bit of its liquid.
Yeah, and a little bit of the liquid from the last batch or the previous batch of kombucha that you made.
All right. So you put the mother in. You made your tea. You added your sugar.
Yep.
You put the mother in. What temperature are we looking at? Warm?
Yeah,
Cool.
warm. 98 to 101, 102, like that.
Really? Do you know when it dies? Like what's too hot for it?
I don't know the exact temperature, to be quite honest with you. I just know that you don't put it in when it's boiling water.
Right.
You wait for it to come down
Right, so it's
to
just
low 100s.
So it's like basically every other bacteria that seems to love that warmth. Same thing with like bread yeast.
Yeah.
Bread yeast loves it around body temperature.
Yeah.
A little pro tip for those out there. Again, forget about the thermometer. Stick your finger in if it feels neutral. That's body temperature, 99, 98 degrees. So.
Yeah, koji too. So then you basically let it sit. Keep it exposed to air, similar to vinegar, yep, but covered so that
Like
bugs
cheesecloth.
and whatever can't come in.
Yeah.
And you just let it do its thing and taste it. It starts taking on a sour sort of, it's like it's turning into vinegar. And in the process, because there's sugar in there, there's also some alcohol that's beginning to form too. So you're basically it's basically like pulling an alcoholic beverage or a vinegar, finishing that process early. And at the very beginning stages of it starting from that perspective. But then you've got this SCOBY that's doing all these other things to it, that's like adding in all of these probiotics and nutrients and stuff, because it's like chowing up all of the stuff that's in the tea and in the sugar.
Interesting. And I wonder how that was figured out. Do you
Totally,
know?
like a SCOBY is like such a complicated organism.
Yeah, right.
You know, I don't know exactly how it was figured out, but I know it was like Asia, Indonesia.
They've come a long way. I remember one time I went to California way back when I was a young buck. I don't know, maybe 18 years old or whatever like that, and I got some kombucha over there. I remember telling my father about it. He's like, "What is that?" And it was so vinegar heavy. It's hard to consume if you have a traditional Western type of palate. It's like, yeah, drinking vinegar. It's hard. And to be honest with you, I don't really love kombucha the way it tastes. And we talked about this.
Yeah, I started getting into the way it tastes, but it's definitely got to be fizzy. So that's a process in the kombucha, by the way. After you've let it go for a little while, you can you can pull the mother off, strain it, and then put it into bottles, which you can prime like champagne. They call this process priming, where you add sugar into it and then close it up airtight. So the sugar starts doing its thing. He could probably talk a lot better about that. But as it does and it has nowhere to go, it starts making carbonation, bubbles.
Yeah. It's the same thing with beer, too. That's where beer gets its fermentation from.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so there's residual yeast in there. It's consuming it, and it's producing carbon dioxide. And then all the yeast dies. But it still creates all that pressure in there.
Yeah.
Basically, it keeps producing carbon dioxide until it dies. It basically, because for those of you who don't know, yeast consumes sugar and essentially farts. That's its excrement, carbon dioxide. It's gas bubbles. So it gives things fermentation. But if it's inside of an enclosed container, it ultimately becomes uninhabitable for itself. Yeah. It basically creates so much of its own waste that it dies in it. All right? So that's kind of the situation.
That sounds delicious. I got into the flavor and everything. I liked it to be a particular level of sweetness. I liked it to be bubbly, and I like it to have a lot of ice in it. That's how it's doable for me.
Sure. Very refreshing, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
But I thought it would be early batches and stuff that I had were kind of energizing to me. They would really light me up, get me going. But I found over time that it actually makes me feel quite sluggish just a few sips in. And I think it's that it's got alcohol in it, It's like a very nominal level of alcohol. So it's not like it gets you particularly buzzed, but
you feel it.
It makes you feel, yeah. I feel it.
You notice there's alcohol.
Not in the energetic kind of way. I feel it in the kind of way that like red wine kind of hits me. It just immediately like slows everything down.
Yeah, right.
And I'm like heavy and just sort of like, whoa, dude, like almost dizzy in a way.
Yeah.
So I kind of had to chill on that, And I checked it out online. It's like there's lots of different ideas about kombucha not really being very good for you because of that.
Because of the alcohol.
Because of the alcohol. And the negative effects and the depressive effects of the alcohol in it far outweigh any probiotics or stuff that's good for your gut biome or your, as they call, microbiome.
Right.
But those theories are conflicted. They're conflicting all over the place.
Cheers to alcohol, right?
Thank you.
No,
it's like alcohol for real, manipulated to be alcohol.
There's no health benefits here, I don't think. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing is like for a while, kombucha's been sort of raised up as looked at as a health tonic.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you get into those types of things, because, as we all love, I mean, not all of us, but as some of us included, enjoy alcohol, it's a toxin.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to have both of those elements there. And again, I don't really know what I'm talking about when it comes to it, but I do know if I'm drinking it and I don't want to get a little buzzed, I'm getting buzzed.
Yeah.
So that's a little difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like I don't do good when I'm trying to drink it. When I drink it, thinking in the context that it's like an uplifter, a healthy beverage for me to be having during the day. That's gonna like give me nutrients and make me feel good. For it to have the opposite effect, like it messes me up actually.
Yeah, certainly. When it comes in regards to fermentation is wild grape wine.
I love it.
So I just made a bunch of that. And we had a big discussion about that, about wild grapes. But what were you going to say?
Yeah, we did. We did have a big discussion about wild grapes. Oh, yeah, now that I think about it, you've talked about this. But I wanted to just back up to where those wild grapes came from and how you harvested those.
Oh, okay.
And it's because it's really intriguing to me.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
So back when I bought my house, you know about all this, right? So
Yeah.
like when I bought my house, the land was not utilized properly by any means. There's a lot of land there. It's an acre and a half where I live, my house. But more than half of it was wooded and just completely overwrought with invasives and grapevines and trees and just all kinds of wild, crazy plants. So I started over a period of time clearing into it, building a beautiful garden. But I've always been a huge fan of wild grapes, also known as like foxberries or fox grapes.
Oh, really? Never knew they were called that.
Yeah, and now there is, when it comes to identifying wild grapes, there's also something called Canadian moonseed, which is... it doesn't really look like grapes. Once you get into it, I mean, it's hard to explain. Like when you're a forager, you know what things look like. If you're a novice, things may look might look a little bit like something else, but there's certain things you pick up on. Anyhow, it doesn't really look like it, but it contains one seed. The fox grape has many seeds inside of it.
Yeah.
So anyhow, it's just beautiful. The flavor is like pomegranate seeds. If you like pomegranate seeds, you'll like these tart, sweet. There's about equal parts tart and sweet. So I had a nice patch, big, beautiful vines, and I was like, you know what? I could completely cut these down, destroy them, or I could train them. So I built an arbor and trained the grapes up there with with butcher's twine and all different kinds of stuff, and really spent my time tying all the vines to get them to grow the way I wanted to. And then I also put in a few different wine grapes as well, like a Concord grape and a red wine grape.
Oh,
and
you put those in?
There's two that are right by these posts. The rest are wild. I mean, there's only two sticks they started off with, and they took about 3 years to mature. But the wild grapes, since I really take care of them, they don't have to compete against anything else. The wild grapes have grown quite plump and large. So I harvest them all from there. I also use some of the grape leaves to sort of salt them, kind of brine them, and create like a dolma wrapper.
Oh, cool.
So anyhow, yeah, I put up some wine. And
cool.
fermented that, and some of it's aging right now in my root cellar. And yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff. I mean, for us with Heirloom Fire, we go through so much stuff during the year. We're trying to optimize the season. A big thing of what we try to focus on is invasive species. Now, if you guys don't know what Japanese knotweed is, look it up. Japanese knotweed, it's also known as fleece flower. Up here at the shop in Richmond, we have tons of it that grows behind our property. It's a relation of bamboo, but it's also related to rhubarb and buckwheat. So we treat it like rhubarb. And we'll preserve it typically when there's different stages. This time of year when it's all dried out, we use it as a smoking medium. It's hollow, it's dry, and it smokes amazingly. And whatever you smoke something over has this almost like a blackberry flavor quality to it.
That's cool. But when it's young, it's like kind of sour.
Definitely.
A little bit sweet.
Yeah, so
it is a lot like rhubarb.
It is, absolutely, yeah. So there's different stages. I mean, for us in the springtime, what I love to get it right when it's beginning to break the soil and then cover it. So it, the sort of photosynthesis doesn't sit in. Yeah, blanching it through natural purposes there. But you collect it. It looks just like asparagus, but pink, like white asparagus, but pink. You can take it and you blanch it in nice salty water, and it tastes just like artichoke hearts.
That's awesome.
So you preserve it in a vinaigrette.
Oh, yeah.
And it's so good. And then it's the combination of that with asparagus. And then, I mean, it's impossible to really beat it back unless you have a backhoe. I mean, the thing about with invasive species is that we got to stop looking at them as the end of the world. Rip it out of the ground, throw it in the ground. No, wild food is powerful. It's delicious, and it's incredibly nutritious for us. The majority of the food that we eat inside of grocery stores has been genetically manipulated to grow in a certain way.
Yeah.
Wild food is hands down always so much more nutritious for us.
Yeah.
Now, there's been studies that have linked some Lyme disease fighting properties into the root of Japanese knotweed.
Really?
People making tinctures out of that and using it, yeah. So, but even if you're not going to use it like that way, why not eat it?
Yeah.
Why not? Instead of, because I know there's also other stories too that there's a lot of nature conservancies going around and injecting the roots with a chemical to kill it, and that's what's dangerous too. So as you're going out and harvesting it, don't collect it from the side of the road, because forget about all the fumes and everything else and the salt and everything else that it's absorbing. you don't know what's been done to it, right? So go out in the wild and find it.
Mm.
So yeah, there's various different ways. As it's sort of before it breaks the soil, you collect it and prepare it the way I was mentioning.
Yeah.
When it gets to be about maybe 6 to 8 inches high, you can treat it just like rhubarb.
Yeah.
It's great, even grilled. Once it starts to break the soil and it's maybe 4 or 6 inches high, there's another nickname for it. It's called snotweed.
Yeah.
It's very gelatinous, almost like
God, I've experienced
okra.
that. Yeah.
Okra, it's not good,
Right.
So we get above that. You want to catch it. Another really great way to preserve it. It's like delicious and totally appeals to our Western palate. Is right when it gets to maybe about 12 inches or so before it starts getting too fibrous. You take it and you thinly slice it, and you can candy the pieces. Now, so use flavors that make sense that go with rhubarb: orange zest, lemon zest, maybe some black pepper. Make a simple syrup, infuse all those flavors
I like
into
that.
it. Cook it until it's nice and thin, either on a mandolin or hand slice it. Put into a dehydrator. It's amazing. Crunchy, delicious, sweet, sour.
Yum.
Anyhow, so the point is like there's a growing season. For us, we're trying to develop a cuisine that is what's growing at this point in time. One of the things I'm excited about is I've been working on today, trying to substitute vanilla, right? Vanilla, it doesn't grow around here, the vanilla fly. Basically, it's a bean, but if you let it go, it develops into a flower.
Yeah.
So if you char, as many of us, bourbon, white wine, certain white wines like Chardonnay, you char the inside of the casks, you actually start to convert a compound inside of oak. So these are all oak casks. When you char them, it converts a certain compound into vanillin. Now, vanillin is what is the same compound that's in vanilla, which makes things taste like vanilla, kind of sweet. So I charred a bunch of different oak chips and pieces of oak branches and ran them through a still today to create hydrosol.
No, good old hydrosol.
Yeah,
It's just a fancy word for water.
There you go. Yeah, it's an off product of trying to collect essential oil. So it's just the water. I want you to try it. It tastes like toasted marshmallow.
Really?
It's really interesting. It's definitely toasted. I charred the hell out of them and then
Yeah.
ran it through a still. Our whole goal is try to use invasive species to beat them back, but also create a cuisine of looking at something like vanilla, like chocolate. How can we develop something that's close to that, but only using local indigenous ingredients?
Yeah.
So
I love that.
yeah. What do you got working right now?
Very much on the same page as you. You.
That's why we're friends.
What?
That's why we're friends.
Is it?
Well,
Are we friends?
no, we're doing this podcast together to hopefully make some money. Thus far, it's not happening. So,
So I don't know if this
I don't know.
friendship's
Is
really
anyone
gonna work
listening?
out.
Is this
Hello?
thing on? Hello or no?
Or no? Yeah, I like to use local products in interesting ways. By interesting, I mean that, as you know, I'm drawn to a lot of traditions in food and cuisine of Asia, various regions of Asia. I don't know why, man. Honestly, I don't know why.
Well, I think it's a bit of, for whatever reason, it might be you're a bit older than me.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a generational thing. A lot of people, I don't know, I want to speak for you, but I notice obviously there's a lot of fusion cuisine. I wonder if it has anything to do with it.
Yeah, maybe.
A while ago, you told me, again, I'm going to interrupt you, sorry. You were really interested in embracing your Jewish heritage.
Oh, yeah. I got excited.
Yeah, and I'm, if I'm being truthful, I'm a bit sad to see that you didn't pursue that more because there is a story there. It is your heritage, it's your culture.
Yeah, it's true. Maybe it has to do with the fact that it was, I think, a few reasons, man, that different people could relate with. One, when I was a kid, to go out for Chinese food or Vietnamese food or Thai food was like a thing. It was exciting. The food was good. It was like sweet. It was oily. It was salty. It was colorful. It was pretty looking. You know, it was a thing. It was good. Mm-hmm. And then when I went into college, my very first cooking job was at a short order place that was preparing classic dishes from around Asia. So there was pad thai, there was lo mein, but then there was like Indonesian stuff, like an Indonesian gado-gado salad, which is like...
What is that?
Gado-gado salad. It was like, I think it's like yellow noodles were on the bottom of it, but it was about the sauce, which was a peanut coconut sauce with peanut butter, coconut, milk, and then from what I remember in this particular recipe, it was coconut flakes. And it was sort of like a thick sauce that you spread through the noodles. And then there are various toppings on top: hard-boiled eggs, fresh cucumber, pickled daikon radish, seitan. That was like on this one anyway. Seitan, which is like a...
Yeah, what is that?
It's basically wheat gluten.
Yeah.
So it's like taking dough and just pounding the living crap out of it and then slowly boiling it.
I mean, I've had it prepared a few ways. I like it.
Yeah, me too. I think it's good.
It's definitely not a meat substitute, but it's
No.
it's its own thing. It's,
It is.
It's kind of tasty.
Asian cuisine appealed to me at that point. That was my first cooking job, and I totally dug it, totally was into it. It made sense for me. So because it formed the foundation of my cooking, sort of through happenstance, I came to love it anyway. And so I've always had a thread of that in my blood as I grew as a chef, you know?
Part of your story.
Yeah, part of the story. You know, also Japanese food, Japanese cuisine, and Japanese cooking tied in with me because early on in my career, I worked at Buddhist monasteries while I was working at nice restaurants. So, like out in the Bay Area, I would be working at a nice restaurant, and on my days off, I'd go to a monastery and meditate and work and volunteer in the kitchen so that I could meditate and sit and be part of the community for free. And those were like really amazing experiences for me. I learned how to cook a lot of stuff in those kitchens. Silent kitchens, it was pretty cool. Just had to talk about, you know, cooking and whatnot, but there wasn't much talking about anything else. Just to stay like focused and present with what we were doing. This brings us to old koji. Koji is a very particular strain of fungus used in fermentation and preservation of many different products, but was found a long time ago to work particularly well with soybeans. Soybeans are a difficult thing to digest, man.
Are they?
Yeah, I don't know about all of the reasons why, but soybeans don't sit well with a lot of us. There's a particular type of, I don't know, acid or something that it puts out that makes it sort of indigestible. You know how they said that story about how corn is kind of indigestible as well?
But it's to do with like the skin, really, on there.
The skin, right?
Yeah,
right.
It's hard to break that down with the stomach acid.
Okay, yeah.
And the
So
kernels. Probably makes the same sense with the skin of
different
but with
reason.
many interesting.
I think it's a different reason.
Okay.
There's just stuff in it that makes it not very digestible, unless you put it through the process, like many different processes. Soaking with seaweed in order to break down some of the and separate out some of the gases. Cooking the living bejesus out of it, drying it, of course. Cooking the crap out of it, and now applying this particular form of fungus, which is affectionately known as koji. So the koji, as how fungus grows, just a quick little tutorial on that, is that mushrooms, they produce strands, a lot of strands, underneath the ground, in a network that interconnects, and those strands are called
mycelium.
Mycelium. Thank you very much.
Of course.
And those mycelium, when on soybeans, will go through and start breaking down the beans. So they're looking for nutrients.
So it's a mushroom-based fungi.
Yeah.
Fungi.
So they're looking for, as the mycelium spreads, it's looking for nutrients, and it digs into the beans, and it starts breaking up the beans in order to extract nutrients out of it. During that process, it's breaking up a lot of the proteins and other compounds down into protein's basic elements, which are amino acids. From there, glutamates are formed. Well, that's like the one that produces a lot of really great flavor. Glutamates.
Yep.
Later on down the road, I think it's actually not very long ago, like in the 40s, it was synthetically reproduced as monosodium glutamate.
MSG, babies.
MSG, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why is that? Do we know why that's bad for you?
No, we don't. We don't know if it is
We
or
as in
not.
you and I? Or what is the
Oh.
do you know why the prevailing theory is that what the media has told us that it's bad for us? Or no?
Yeah, it's sort of like a bunch of hype. There was a scare for a short time that got spread around for a pretty long time. Some argue that it's actually racist, and that it's just straight racism.
Really?
Yeah, and an attempt to squash Chinese immigration into our country. Like prevailing theories, as
I don't doubt it.
MSG was thought to be harmful because of all of these reported and seemingly obvious effects of them, instantaneous effects on them, of us, or on us from them. And it's kind of been debunked by science as time has gone on. You'll see chefs speaking out about the glories of MSG now. Dave Chang is one of them. And you could actually see videos of him debunking it, holding workshops or sessions of people eating various things with MSG in them without them knowing, and them having no effect on them. And a lot of those things are like their favorite foods, like Doritos and other nacho cheese chips and stuff, basically have MSG in them. So people are like, oh yeah, I love these, but Chinese food, it just like really messes up my head. It's like,
oh, interesting.
and it's just one of those things that doesn't have any serious scientific finding behind it actually being harmful. Maybe down the road, who knows, as it's looked at for a longer period of time, like GMOs,
Sure, yeah.
like maybe it'll come to find out that it's harmful, but as of now, there aren't any particular findings.
Interesting.
So anyway, glutamates are the protein or the amino acids that get broken down by the mycelium of koji as it's growing, and that develops flavor, and it in turn makes soybeans more digestible to the system.
Wow.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really great.
Yeah, so what I've been excited about is, I'm sort of on my third trial with koji, making various things with koji. There was one a year and a half ago. No, there was one 2.5 years ago when I first started playing with it, and I was all excited about it. And I made some really disgusting, terrible stuff. One of which I actually have to crack into is a tamari that I made that at that time 2.5 years ago, and it's just been sitting in an airlock for the whole time.
Why does it look disgusting? Is there mold in it?
There's some mold on top. I'm not too worried about it.
Even with an airlock?
What I'm worried about is the smell. Yeah, I don't know how it got in there, man. I think because there was a period of time that it was just doing its thing with cheesecloth before I got the airlock and put it on it.
Has the mold grown?
No, it's just been sitting there not moving for 2.5 years. It's like this mucusy looking orange yellow substance.
Yes.
But and I remembered the koji. Anyway, there's a lot of detail into making koji, because you basically have to grow it on soybeans, or it could be on a grain as well.
Yeah, so you purchased it. I mean, the most common one I've seen is you purchase it and it's on grain.
Rice.
Yeah, it's rice specifically.
Rice
but there are
specifically.
some liquid forms too.
Yeah, I've seen that too. What I found to be the purest is straight powder. It was a lot of times that powder has been grown. It's koji that was grown on a grain like rice, and then the rice gets just ground up to a really, really fine powder with the koji on it. But there are other processes like the really, really fine koji. It grows on the rice, and then it's very carefully extracted off of the rice. So you end up with pure, koji fungus powder, spores.
It must be super stupid expensive.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy how expensive that stuff can get. Upwards of $10,000 a gram.
What? That's
Craziness,
insane.
dude. Crazy
That's insane.
stuff. But it's these particular concentrations or particular strains and processes make a koji that has a certain potency for what you're trying to use it for. Like there's some that are specific for specific types of soybeans and specific types of grains and all that. Very specific strains of koji or aspergillus. Aspergillus oryzae is the one that's typically used that grows on rice. But there are other types of aspergillus koji that are used more specifically for soybeans. So in this case, I'm using this other one. I'm not using oryzae because I'm doing this batch of koji on soybeans, and I'm like remembering my experiences, my last couple of rounds of using it, and I just made the best batch of koji on these soybeans, dude. And I'm stoked about it. I put it just in the right environment. I got these like super, I know you're probably going to think this is disgusting, but I got these like super white fuzzy soybeans
Saw it in your
that are
Instagram
like
story.
clumping.
Yeah.
It's like beautiful.
Looks great.
Like they form these like giant clumpy nuggets of awesome. You smell it and it's like sweet. It just smells like sweet sugar. So good. So I know they're doing their thing like really, really, really well.
I love that.
Tomorrow I put them into a salt brine and stir it once a week for the first couple of months, and hopefully things will be going well and no weird molds or other bacteria or fungus will get in.
Do you know why what is the purpose of putting into a salt brine? Just to lacto ferment it?
This is to start the process of making soy sauce. So it's that brine that will eventually be harvested to make soy sauce.
And so then all the grains and things you've done, what happens with those after you strain it? So eventually they're all going to settle to the bottom, right?
They're going to break up, so
Yeah.
the beans are going to continue to get eaten up.
Yes.
I've also toasted a bunch of wheat and ground that up in there too.
Is that
That's
traditional?
key to the process. Yeah,
Okay.
it's a traditional soy sauce, yeah.
Okay.
There's soy sauce and there's tamari. Tamari typically does not have that in it. Soy sauce does have the wheat in it. So a lot of tamari out there is gluten-free. However, there are some traditional tamari making processes that do involve wheat. But anyway, that stuff will just break down. It'll basically turn to like sludge. And it'll be either a process of, like I see how Noma extracts a soy sauce or a liquid or a tamari as it's forming in a ferment. Like, tamari forms in the process of making miso too.
Right.
But they'll like stick a tube in there.
Siphon it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and siphon it out slowly and delicately.
Yeah. So then what do they do with the solid in the bottom or whatever that is in the bottom? What do they do with it?
Yeah, good question.
Could you then use
I've
that
seen
like a
people use
miso?
it to make miso. Yeah,
Yeah.
people make miso, or them like I think that you could use it to just make dressings, or you could even use it to marinate something.
Sure.
Marinate it overnight.
Sure. Yeah.
Because there are a lot of contemporary uses of koji now, and these types of byproducts of the making of soy sauce and misos and stuff, where they're being used now to like break down proteins in meat and to make them more tender and delicious, and to infuse more flavor into them.
Yes.
To break down some of those proteins into amino acids, which will release these, beautiful flavors, man.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could see like burying a duck inside of that, and letting it do its thing for like 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen recipes about that. It's
Oh,
really
really?
intriguing. Yeah, specifically koji cured duck.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, really
That's
interesting.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that stuff online. There's like koji cured steaks, and the people do like side by side. They'll try to do koji cured versus just like salt cured or dry aged.
Sure.
And some people are like meh, and other people are like, dude, this is by far like way better.
Yeah, right. It's interesting how people will get into that sort of hype thing. Either they're like it's too much hype and they're like they're gonna rail against it, or they're just gonna be open to the experience. And there's some people that probably romanticize it and make up the whole entire thing and like, oh my god, this is so amazing.
Yeah, right. So true. Yeah, I mean, no matter what, regardless, it seems like koji is coming into the repertoire or the lexicon of the modern day chef, because it's this whole new tool that's being embraced in all these ways in restaurants all over the place, and you won't even know it on a lot of menus. Like, I know that in Boston there's just like this whole sort of cult underground scene of people experimenting with koji in various ways. making marinades and sauces and basically like boosting flavors and making super tender, juicy, awesome stuff.
Yeah.
It's kind of almost like using MSG, but it's like a total naturally produced version of MSG.
Right. Yeah. And MSG is like what? It's like specifically, as people say, oh, you use it. It's a flavor enhancer, is what it's labeled as. So that must hit the umami center, right?
Yeah. It's
I mean, I know over in Noma, they're like getting really crazy with developing like their own strands of mold. This really interesting recipe. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but they'll make like this tart. It's with a cured egg yolk, and it looks like a Linzer tort or something like that. Or you know how like you get the raspberry cookies or the tort that's got like the powdered sugar. It looks just like that. They have it cut out in certain ways. It's incredible. Like I cannot wait. I had pre-COVID, I had actually secured tickets to go to Noma, and I was super stoked to go there and try that because I could not wait. Like I want to tear everything they do. I am so interested in this constant evolution is so beautiful and so inspiring to me.
Yeah,
I love that.
Totally, man. Absolutely, me too.
Yeah.
So freaking cool.
Yeah.
So anyways, I'll let you all know how the soy sauce is coming. Maybe, I want to give it a long time, like a year to do its thing.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll still be doing podcasts at that point. We could do a side-by-side blind tasting with another reputable brand or something like that.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
I also would like to do the Korean version for making soy sauce at some point. Doesn't involve koji. Doesn't involve much, actually, except salt and some jujubes and some charcoal.
So jujubes, that's like the candy?
No, jujubes, actually, it's not a candy. That's like that's what we think of. But jujubes, it's actually a berry that grows in regions of Asia.
Really?
And it's like a big red berry that's kind of sweet. It's kind of tart, but it's kind of like bitter and deep. I'd say that it probably has elements of the umami flavor to it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I wonder if it's, in this case, I'm pretty sure that it must act as some kind of antioxidant or like a preserving agent for fermenting stuff from time to time. So the Korean version of making soy sauce is wild. It's like similar beginning, where you soak soybeans and then cook the crap out of them. But then you form those soybeans into bricks and you let them dry, like in a warm environment. People in Korea, households in Korea, just put it by a heater. Or they often have these heating pads that they use in their houses, like in apartments and units and stuff like that. They have these heating pads that they can specifically use for this. And so you rotate the brick until it's like dried and crusted. And then you hang that for a really, really long time until it's like a brick, like there's no moisture left in it at all. And then you put that into a salt brine solution with the jujubes and a piece of burnt wood or like a piece of charcoal.
What's the purpose of the charcoal?
I don't know. I think it must be a preservative of some sort. It must be doing something antimicrobial or something like that.
What's another weird thing too is how do they figure that out?
Right.
Or I mean, it could have been many things like, oh, maybe I like the way this tastes. Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, like maybe it helps offset some of the funk,
Yeah, right.
Because apparently it gets real stinky and funky as that's happening. So no koji's even involved in that at all. And then it just sits in the brine. And so you start in a particular time of year. You're cooking those soybeans in the winter time. And then as spring comes up, your bricks are pretty much dried and ready to rip. And that's when you put them in the brine. And then throughout the summer, it's like this thing like sort of becomes part of your little family. You've got this jar of soy sauce growing. You put it out in the sun and take the lid off and let it get infused with that as time goes on.
Sure,
and you kind of hang out with it in the backyard on like pretty days.
Yeah, take care of it better than you do your own children, maybe.
Okay.
Well,
I won't take that the wrong way.
Well, I think it's time we have an intervention. No, I'm kidding. Oh,
no.
God.
Yeah, so the first time I tried that, it was freaking disgusting because I didn't rotate it when at the first stage when it was a brick and I had it by the heat. It was perfect, beautiful environment for it. And I didn't turn it, so the bottom side got real gross.
Yeah.
So 7 days later, I came to check it out and was like, oh no, all the sides on the top look so good. I was so
perfect,
excited,
right.
and I picked it up and was like, oh my god, that's so gross.
Yeah, right.
Duh.
Yeah.
Of course I should be rotating it.
Yeah, I think all of us that have fooled around with fermentation or something like that have stories like
Something
that
like
because
that
it's.
happens.
I think, yeah, because it's not common practice, right? I mean, it's not something that's drilled into us that we need to be doing, and that is where all those steps are really important. You just got to understand the specific conditions these things thrive in.
And there are actually very specific environments for some of this aging that is required that you have to very closely monitor and watch. I think, even though historically they were not, how did they know how to put it in the right spot and that it would do its thing?
Trial and error. I mean, I guess it's the same thing. It probably comes down to is how they know that beer was going to work, how they know that wine was going to work. You know, maybe it's trial and error and trying things over and over again, that natural human intuition.
Yeah, like I've even seen like Chinese homesteads and stuff historically. It looks so simple. It's like basically just making, grinding meat or whatever, making it into a sausage, or even taking slabs and like pieces of meat, seasoning them, making sure they've got plenty of salt and plenty of hot peppercorns or Sichuan pepper or some kind of chili, and then literally like hanging it on their porch, dude. And it just goes through, like it just lives there in the elements. Yeah. And it just magically does its thing. Like, what the heck? How do you hone that, like, instinct or that ability, you think?
Trial and error, and, like, eating something when you were on the verge of starving to death and being like, oh, okay. Because I know a lot of colonial explorers and settlers and things, when they would smoke things like we talked about earlier, salt wasn't plentiful at that point in time. They would literally just smoke the meat until it dried out, until the water activity, there was basically no water left. It was like beef jerky.
Wow.
In order for most bacteria to grow, basically all bacteria, you need some level of moisture and oxygen. But there is one particular one, botulism, which thrives in a zero oxygen environment.
That one's scary, man.
It's
That's
very
particularly scary, that one.
Yeah, for sure.
It grows in like oil.
Yeah, that's super
Garlic
scary.
and shit.
Yeah. You just don't know.
Yeah.
And a good rule of thumb, obviously, is when you're smelling something, if it smells really bad. Now, like we talked about, sort of counterintuitive, we talked about sort of the sour milk smell earlier. But if you're working with, say, proteins, if it smells like death, like rot, don't chance it. If you're uncertain about anything, even if it is the milk, don't chance it. Get comfortable. If you want to push further and give things a try it. If you're not comfortable, don't push yourself. It depends on your level of comfort. So, yeah, I mean, with charcuterie is something where, I mean, when I very first started making charcuterie, I started off in a basement. And it was wonderful. It was like a basement that it was such a huge, like a high humidity level. And anytime it rained, the basement would flood. It was always very chilly down there, maybe like 50, 60 degrees. It was a perfect condition for making charcuterie.
So also with that, well, that's good that it was a perfect condition, because also when I think about flooding and humidity and stuff, I think about particular types of molds that are not very beneficial for making charcuterie. And like I see like a battle ensuing between like the good bacteria down there trying to get up on that meat and make it awesome, and like black mold trying to come in, like the dark horse.
Yeah. So there's definitely different kinds of molds. Black mold is universally across the board bad. It can actually hear stories of it impregnating walls, drywall, and actually killing people, the mold spores. So it's not to be messed with. You look at certain molds, it means different things. So green mold tends to usually mean there's not enough airflow, green and blue mold. The goal with that particular reason, why, like that particular area, why it was so good was that it had the humidity level and it had the temperature working. And at that point, I was using commercially bought charcuterie strands, different molds, different bacterias that helped lower the pH. I've since sort of evolved into using a natural style of fermentation, but not buying in freeze-dried cultures, actually just through homemade yogurt, because it's the lactobacillus which is what consumes all the pathogens in the meat, which gets it down low. So a couple different things. So, I mean, so when you're looking at like a salami as an example, Genoa salami, sopressata, chorizo, anything that's inside of a casing, it has to go through a fermentation process. And the process for that is you run it through a meat grinder. Yeah. And again, anytime, if you guys are making this stuff, know where your meat is coming from.
Yeah.
Develop relationships with local farmers. Go out there, see how the animals are raised. You want to see them on pasture. You want to see them having a good life. You want to see them on good feed. So you know where it's coming from. It's not coming from a potential bad source that could be exposed to different pathogens or bacteria. So you get good quality product. Pork in this case, you grind it up, you stuff it into a casing. I like natural casings, and again, it all depends on what type of gauge you want. There's sheep's casings, which are, if you think something like a Slim Jim casing, that is a smaller gauge casing.
They're skinny. Yeah.
They're very skinny. You go into hog casings, which are going to be your typical sort of medium-sized charcuterie. And there's beef bungs, which are larger,
Those
which you would see
boys.
like Genoa salami, sopressatas, larger ones like this.
Yeah.
So anyhow, you pack them, you grind them, and you pack them into that type of casing. You pierce the outsides. Now you want to pierce the outside of the casing so that the air can get through to it, because air is very important. You want constant airflow, like we just talked about. Quick little tip is, if you're going to grind your meat, salt it first overnight. What will happen is the salt will help pull out all the proteins from the meat, which will help it bind better like glue.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And
That's
then,
good thinking.
so yeah, you salt it first, and then the next day you add your seasonings, wine, whatever else you're going to use.
And also, you're looking for a particular ratio of lean meat to fat, right?
Yeah, generally it's about 30% fat you're looking for.
30% fat.
And a good rule of thumb is, if you're going to get pork shoulder, that's usually the ideal place to get it from, because it has that nice mixture. It's almost a perfect ratio of meat to fat. Hams are great to use in salamis, different ground meats. They're very lean, so you'll need to incorporate back fat. So you'll add your seasonings. You'll grind it the next day, and then you have to put it into some sort of stand mixer, KitchenAid or a larger mixer, because that also helps develop and work out more of the proteins, so it becomes more of a glue. Then you put it into some sort of sausage stuffer. You stuff your casings, you tie them off, you prick them so the air gets through. Now, at that point, when you've added your culture after it's been ground, or rather, I'm sorry, before it's been ground, you're going to add it so it fully incorporates and it gets mixed. Now, you want to transfer it to it likes an area that's about 80 degrees. High humidity, 100% humidity. And for that, people use those like small little like college dorm sort of refrigerators. Forget about that. It's just too small. Get your hands on an old proofing box. See if you can find a restaurant's going out of business, somebody that's selling one, or whatever. Craigslist, or just buy one. Honestly, it's not going to be that expensive. You're going to plan on making it. That's a really great unit to have. At that point, in the bottom of it, you put in a humidifier. Now, I have a very specific brand that I use. It's strange. It's a Vicks warm air vaporizer.
Really?
Yes. And you have it hooked up just like you have it, hooked up by a company called Inkbird. It's it's a humidifier controller. It's a two-stage unit. So it helps you, you plug in your unit to it. You can program it to know what temperature you want it to be at. So for me, it's 80 degrees, and I know it's going to be pumped through humidity. It's in a closed area. Now, I've also cut a hole in the front of it with small fans that I've put in and then hooked up to USB plugs that I can then have circulate air. So you want to let that sit in there for 3 days. So according to the rules,
just 3 days, huh?
3 days. Well, 3 days you have to buy a pH meter. Now that's the only way it's going to be for you to be able to officially show. And again, going back to the disclaimer, this is for you. Do not sell product. Do not sell product, because you need to be able to be USDA certified or state certified.
Yeah.
So you test your pH meter. It needs to be below 5.0. Now, the rules state that you need to get below 5.0 pH within 36 hours. If it's not below 5.0 in 36 hours, it's a good chance it's never going to get below that. So at that stage, there might be some mold that starts to develop. You can let it hang out there for another day if you want, just to develop another little layer of mold. Because the goal is there. You have your penicillin camembert, I believe it's the pronunciation is. It's basically the same white mold that would be on a camembert or a brie. And what that does is that's a good mold.
Yeah, that's
so it's a really, really good mold. Do you know why?
Snowy white. No.
Because what it does is it actually consumes oxygen. And that's its whole thing, is that it consumes oxygen on the outside of it. That's its fuel, just like we talked about different things. Kombucha, sugar, bread, sugar, stuff like that, sourdough, flour. Now, because of that, it doesn't allow any other bacteria to grow on top of it. It makes it uninhabitable for nothing else. Now, same thing with when you're doing whole mussels. Think about, I mean, people go like, oh, it's prosciutto, or it's whatever. Not every charcuterie item, dried, cured item, is prosciutto. Prosciutto is the hind quarter of a pig.
Right.
So there's copa or capicola, which comes from the pork collar, which is a really fantastic piece of charcuterie. There's a lot of connective tissue there. It's very tough. Really what you do with any of those types of things, you can also use bresaola, which is a red wine cured beef eye round. You can take your pork loins, instead of making pork chops, you can make something called lomo, which is like a orange zest and rosemary cured pork loin. Lonzino, which is the pork tenderloin, same situation, smaller. You can do the same sort of cure on it.
So just quickly, are there certain types of meats or certain types of cuts that are tough, that are tenderized in the process of making charcuterie?
No, I would think unanimously every bit of charcuterie, because you're eliminating the water volume, is going to be incredibly tough. So that's why it's always served paper thin. Because you're cutting through the muscle fibers. You're basically intensifying the muscle fibers at that point. So you want to thinly slice it. So what's the payoff there? So you use tough cuts. Tough cuts gets the most exercise, meaning they're tougher, meaning they have more blood in them, meaning they have more flavor. It's more developed.
Yeah, right.
So you cure them, which intensifies that flavor. Just much like anything, when you're making a stock, you reduce down the water, or making tea, or anything you reduce down, it just intensifies the flavor.
Yeah.
And at that point, you thinly slice it, and it's been cured, and it's absolutely delicious. And that's what I love about charcuterie. Is a great way, especially if you're raising an animal yourself, to be able to spread its life out more.
Have you had some missteps?
Charcuterie? Oh,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. I mean, there's been things where it all really comes down to, so going back to the salamis, after you take it out of the incubation chamber and it's below 5.0, then you move it into a drying chamber, which at that point is about 60 to 70% humidity, full air circulation at about 58 degrees. And that's what my cabinet is over there. Therefore, you need to weigh your product after that, and you want it to lose approximately 30% of its weight. That's when it's ready to take out. Cryovac. If you don't cryovac it, all kinds of crazy stuff's going to happen to it. Missteps, absolutely. Missteps happen when you don't have the right circulation. It gets, you can develop some kind of weird molds and different strains where it becomes slimy. It's just not good. It smells bad. Something that's not properly sealed. I've had different charcuteries where I've put into Ziploc bags that haven't had all the air pressed out, and the white mold has gone crazy. And the white mold, yes, it protects the charcuterie, but it also is an enzyme, has enzymatic process where it will actually start to break it down and further dehydrate it. It becomes crystally and just gross.
Oh, wow.
So basically how charcuterie works, I'll explain that to you, is if you think about a blood cell, if you put it into an area where it's in a situation, it is just like an eggshell in the way that it's permeable, is osmosis process that happens. Take a blood cell which naturally has some level of salt in it. You put it into a regular water solution, what's going to happen is, since it's going back and forth through the osmosis process, the osmotic pressure, what happens is it pulls out the salts. And what will happen is all that stuff that's been sort of helping it preserve and stay itself, it will then become rotten because there's nothing to preserve it. It will die. Now, if you put it in a very salty solution, what will happen is it'll actually pull all the moisture out of it, then causing it to shrivel up and die. Now, the only way it stays is if you put it in its basically equal salinity. It stays the same. So with charcuterie, what you're doing is you're generally submerging it in a lot of salt. And what happens is the cell walls become very irritated because of the salt. It's drawing the moisture out. As the cell walls open up to expel moisture, it pulls salt in. And it generally, like a great example is like a duck breast or something like that. If you cure it for 24 hours, it becomes a little bit firmer. The longer you let any charcuterie goes, it pulls more moisture out, it becomes firmer.
Yeah, it makes me think about brining too.
Yeah, totally. It's exactly right with that process, except for you're not exposing it. You're sort of, it's equal parts salinity, so it's coming in. So I'm sorry, there's equal parts salinity to water generally,
Right.
so it's kind of passing in and out, and it stays hydrated.
Right.
Though
and
it is
like
accepting
sucks
it.
in the salt too.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah. So with the charcuterie, there is no water. It's literally just pulling out, pulling out, pulling out. So with that, ends up being when the surface of the charcuterie is so dried out. Obviously, I've seen other parts of charcuterie where my fails have been if I haven't left it in cure long enough, or if you're not going to cryovac it, which cryovacking is hands down the best way to cure anything, because what happens, it pulls out all of the air and increases the pressure, which drives the salt deeper into the product. Now, you can do it in a bus tub or something if you're doing large quantities, because let's be honest, vacuum bags are expensive.
Yeah.
So but you just need to turn it every day. And generally, you want to cure something for maybe 14 days, depending on its size. You want to turn it every day and
I remember
rotate
doing
it.
that,
Yeah. And on top of that, at that point, once it's the cure, the fail I had was the cure didn't penetrate all through the center. So it's beautifully cured outside, and the inside is off-colored or gray or something like that. So
And salt amount is probably really important too.
yeah, you don't want to skimp on salt. You want definitely more salt than what you think. Now, other things you need to make sure after you've taken it out of cure, you rinse it really, really, really well. And then you hang it with a whole mussel. At that point, you don't need to ferment it. The fermentation happens already through the salting process, almost like a sort of a lacto type of style. Now, how that prevents it from getting any sort of bacteria on is that the layer of the skin on top of the charcuterie is so salty that any bacteria that tries to adhere to it, it immediately sucks all the moisture out of that bacteria and kills it. Because it just makes it like that's the same idea with the osmosis process.
Yeah.
It just kills it all off.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's all different kinds of all different kinds of wild stuff. So
Wow.
again, there's so many. I mean, with that type of stuff, we're just scratching the surface on it. But I think for us, as our sort of takeaway here, as we get to our end of our conversation, I would encourage all of you to try a few things. A great beginner's type of book to take a look at is a book by Michael Ruhlman called Charcuterie, which is really nice. There's a lot of great illustrations in there, some great beginner's recipes. I would give that a shot.
Yep.
I mean, one of the things I would easily say is to even mess around with is try to make your own gravlax, cured salmon. It's dirt simple. Now, we're going to kind of go through some of these recipes, but if you guys are interested in actually getting the hard copy of the recipes, shoot us an email at figurativelyfeasting@gmail.com, and I can send you a copy of the recipes.
Yeah, for $300 per recipe.
Oh, well, we're getting tight now. I was going $350, but a couple things you might want to give a shot. So I mentioned earlier copa. Look up that recipe. That's a really, really simple recipe to do. And look up some basic stuff. What you're looking for, this is a bit more complicated. It's a bit more advanced. So you're looking for an area. It's a closet. Now, or maybe a closet or something like that has airflow. That's about 58 degrees and about 70% humidity. So how are you going to guess? Oh my God, I have no idea. How do I measure humidity? Well, go on Amazon, go to some store, like a hardware store. There's all different kinds of meters that actually show you. It's called a hydrostat, but there's also in conjunction a thermometer as well included in that. It's a great way to take a look at it. Something a lot easier is making gravlax, as I mentioned earlier. So get salmon. I like steelhead trout. Steelhead trout is comparable and it's less overfished than salmon, but that's a whole other topic about ocean health.
Yeah,
because
it is.
There's once people get turned on to something, supply and demand, things get overfished and it's dangerous. But I like steelhead trout.
Sorry, go on.
I'm sorry. I like steelhead trout. It has the same characteristics as salmon. It's not as typically fishy as trout can be.
Yeah.
So with that, I mean, you just got to remember the golden equation, 50-50-50. So you take equal parts salt and sugar.
Yep.
And you have, it's 50% of the weight of whatever your product is. So if you have a 3-pound fillet, then you want 1.5 pounds of that mixture of the salt and the sugar. And you can add in whatever you want. Could be dill, could be ground coriander, whatever. And juniper, totally.
So
all
good,
different kinds of fennel seeds, whatever you want to do. Grind them up, grind them up.
Pour a little booze over the top of it too.
Sure, yeah, like gin.
Gin.
Gin's the way to go, yeah. So, wrap it, make your salt mixture, make a little bed with cling film, saran wrap, down with your salt mixture, put your filet on top, cover it with the other half, Wrap it on up and let it sit. And you want to really put it between 2 cookie sheets and weigh it down. And maybe you get some cans of soup or something like that. Because that'll give you even distribution of your cure. So you'll usually do that for 24 hours if you want like a light cure, 48 hours for a stronger cure, 36 hours for a really hard cure. And that means it's very dense. Now, different kinds of salts. You never really want to use iodized salt with salmon because it'll actually turn it brown.
That's interesting. I never knew that.
Yeah, granulated salt can be really, really salty.
Wow.
Kosher salt's good. If you can get your hands on rock salt, ultimately that's going to be the best way to go because think about it as an ice cube. That's why big old fat rocks cubes inside of cocktails, they slowly melt. So same situation with the size of salt. Slowly going to get into it. And it's easier to clean too because if you have really, really fine granulated salt, it's going to be a lot more challenging to remove it. So yeah, after that, you let it go, and then it's fully cured and ready to rip. And if you want, you can then cold smoke it if you have that type of setup. That's something I want to explain more about in the future. But then you have smoked salmon. I love that type of stuff.
Yeah, man, so much. Me too.
What's your recipe, baby?
I think you could do a lot of different basic stuff when you're starting to get going and get success early on to make you feel good. One thing is cured egg yolk. I find that to be something that's like you could just be in the process of baking yourself some muffins and just be like, maybe I'll crack this 1 extra egg, separate out the yolk, and basically bury it in a mixture of sugar and salt and whatever other flavorings you like for however long, a certain amount of time. I find that after about a week and a half, it's starting to firm up. There's stuff, and then from that point, that you could be done with it. It's sort of firm. It's kind of nice. You can slice it. You can grate it a little bit, but it might be a little bit sticky on your grater. And you could use it like Parmesan if you'd like, or you can just kind of slice it up, spread it on a piece of toast. Pretty freaking good. Some honey. Yeah. Cured egg yolk and honey on a piece of toast.
Good. Yeah, totally. Because again, you're playing with that salty and sweet situation.
Totally. Always into
and
that.
And like that just rich. So you're hitting so many beautiful receptors there.
Yeah. Or you could start playing with the process of slow drying and aging something. You can take those yolks, tie them up in a cheesecloth, tie the cheesecloth with butcher's twine, and hang it. You can hang it in your fridge. You can, if you're at work, and you work at restaurants, you could hang it in a corner of your walk-in, or you can just hang it out in the air in about like room temperature. Try not to get it too warm. Try not to get it too cold though, because then it won't really do much either. And just let it do its thing. They're like very resilient. They're not gonna get moldy easily. They don't require super specific environment, and you can keep those going for really like a long time. I forgot about some once. They were going for like a year and a half. I pulled it out. It was like fossilized.
Whoa, that must have been good.
It was so good. Fresh pasta ravioli, and I grated it on top of it. It was like so good. It tasted a lot like Parmesan, but it had that sort of eggy kind of sweet element to it too. Yeah. So good.
Yeah, and if you need to speed it up with that, we've done it before. We put it into dehydrators. Salt it for 24 hours and dehydrate it at like 100 degrees. Sometimes people will actually take them and candy them too instead of doing salt, because the cure that I usually do is like 50-50 again. So half salt, half sugar, but people will just straight up do them in sugar.
Nice.
And pulls out the moisture and using it in a dessert application.
Yeah.
So you have a nice skin on the outside, then a jammy consistency in the center. So the cooks out there, think about that. You got that salt, you got that sweetness on the outside. What are you going to pair that with? So anyhow, well, I hope today you found this podcast exciting. We barely scratched the surface. There's so much.
We'll have to do a part 2 at some point.
We say with basically every podcast. The thing with these is that they can tend to get long. The meat podcast we did was very long. And also, just a quick side note on that, I ended up speaking to somebody who was a little put off by the level of detail that we put into that podcast. And my response to them was that, that was actually by design.
Yeah.
Because that is the entire process. The whole reason why we started this podcast was to get people to feel something, to talk about real real topics.
Yeah,
here.
man.
That's
Absolutely.
our goal. Just like, if we are going to eat meat, what is the cost? There's always a balance to everything.
Yeah.
So that was just simply my response. That was by design. That's our
We
goal
could have
here.
gone further. Like the research that I did during that time, I really took a deep dive into what was going on in factory farming and stuff. There's some pretty horrific images there.
For sure, yeah. So, we try to keep these consumable at a regular pace because listening to something for 2.5 hours like that can be a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Mom, for listening all the way through.
Yeah,
and
right.
Dad, too. I think you did, too.
Yeah, right. So let us know what you think about it. I mean, it's very important for us to receive feedback.
And also, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I think there were more than just my parents who listened all the way through that, because you check out the analytics. So, thank you to all of those out there who stuck it out and got all the way through that one. It's important, and we're really trying to go with a longer format here so that we could really flesh out some of our ideas and some of our thoughts and go deep with you guys,
Yeah, we want you guys to learn a little bit more. We could easily keep this to an hour.
Yeah.
But we're not really touching on stuff here. So we want to know your feedback.
Yeah, feedback.
And thank you for everyone who's been listening. You have no clue how much it means to us.
Yeah.
I mean, we're doing this as like a project to help inspire ourselves, but also really to kind of get people to think, to hopefully have some level of impact. And we're both so excited about it. So let us know. I want to see more comments. If you could, I would highly, really, really appreciate it if you were to give us a rating on iTunes or Spotify or wherever it allows us to. Give us a thumbs up on YouTube. And the reason is that it helps us get our message out there to more people.
Yeah.
So the higher the rating is, the more people get to listen in and hopefully learn something new. For those of you that are using the old Instagram, my handle is @ChefJamesGopp and @HeirloomFire.
My handle is @Chef Simeon.
Perfect. So please give us a shout out, give us a follow. Let us know your thoughts, please. We always want to know, as I always say, we always want to know what's going on, what's your feedback, what are things you want to learn about. As always, the email address is figurativelyfeasting@gmail.com. So we look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you so much for checking in. Simeon, thank you for taking the time
Yes,
tonight.
thank you too, James.
Always
Thank
appreciate
you very much, sir.
It was a pleasure, and we'll see you guys very soon.
Bye.
Bye.